President Lee Jae-myung and his UAE counterpart Mohammed bin Zayed Al Nahyan held a summit in Abu Dhabi on Tuesday, looking to broaden their countries' collaboration in defense, AI, nuclear energy, and culture. North Korea slammed the recent joint fact sheet announced by South Korea and the U.S. on their trade and security agreements as formalizing a confrontational stance against the regime. South Korean shares closed below the 4,000 level on Monday on chip and tech losses over fears of an AI bubble and uncertainty about a rate cut by the U.S. Federal Reserve. President Lee Jae-myung is on a 3-day state visit to the UAE, having kicked off his four-nation trip to the Middle East and Africa. Our Presidential Office correspondent Yoon Jung-min is in Abu Dhabi. Jung-min, I believe President Lee sat down with his UAE counterpart there, right?
You're right, Tammy. So I'm currently at the Korean Peninsula in Abu Dhabi, and the talks here in Abu Dhabi began with an official welcoming ceremony at the UAE Presidential Palace for the South Korean leader who's visiting the country for a state visit. The President Lee Jae-myung was greeted by the UAE's President Mohammed bin Zayed Al Nahyan. There was a 21-gun salute, a traditional UAE performance, and an air show to welcome the South Korean president. The leaders also inspected a guard of honor. The leaders held talks followed by expanded talks and the signing of MOUs. Cooperation on AI, the defense industry, and culture would have topped the summit agenda.
확고한 신뢰와 상호 존중 그리고 형제의 정신을 기반으로 앞으로 어떤 외부의 상황 변화가 있더라도 결코 흔들리거나 후퇴하지 않도록
The special strategic partnership between Korea and the UAE has been bearing fruit in many areas. The economy, energy, high technology, culture and defense are only to start with.
The UAE is the only country in the Middle East to have established a special strategic partnership with Korea, and the region is deemed crucial for South Korea's exports of key items. Later, the leaders had a luncheon. I should note that streets here are fully prepared to welcome the South Korean leader, having installed flags of the two countries side by side along the streets around the presidential palace and the airport. Some of the iconic places in Abu Dhabi, including ADNOC headquarters, were lit up in the colors of Korea's Taegukgi flag.
I see. Now, Jung-min, ahead of the summit, President Lee had an interview with a local newspaper there. What were the key messages?
So cooperation with the Arab nation largely was front and center. And in an earlier interview with a local newspaper, Al Ittihad, the Korean president said the summit will lay the foundation for a new centennial phase in relations between the two nations. He stressed cooperation on AI semiconductors, renewable energy, as well as small modular reactors, building upon the success of Baraka's construction and operation. South Korea also plans to establish a new Korean center in the UAE by 2030 for more active cultural exchange and trade between the two countries. Back to you, Dami.
All right, Jung-min, thanks for that coverage. That was our top office correspondent, Yoon Jung-min, live from Abu Dhabi. In other news, 4 days after South Korea and the U.S. released their joint fact sheet, North Korea issued a commentary denouncing it, saying that the fact sheet shows a confrontational stance against the regime. It warned of countermeasures. An Sung-jin tells us more.
North Korea on Tuesday slammed the recently unveiled fact sheet and joint statement of the annual defense talks, the security consultative meeting between South Korea and the U.S. Pyongyang's official response comes 4 days after the documents were released last Friday. Saying such documents formalize Seoul and Washington's confrontational stance against Pyongyang, the commentary published by the North Korean Central News Agency said the regime will take countermeasures to safeguard its own sovereignty. The commentary argued how the announcements from the summit helped the North clearly see the Trump administration's stance toward the regime. Particularly, the regime said U.S. reaffirming the goal of the North's complete denuclearization shows its confrontational intent to completely deny the regime's identity and existence. Regarding the part that said South Korea and the U.S. would cooperate to implement the 2018 North Korea-U.S. joint statement made in Singapore, Pyongyang said this showed the shameless side of Washington and said that the U.S. had scrapped and nullified past agreements. On the U.S. approval for South Korea to build nuclear-powered submarines, the regime criticized the move as a grave development that destabilizes not only the military and security landscape of the Korean Peninsula, but the entire Asia-Pacific region. Calling South Korea's pursuit of nuclear submarines a stepping stone for its own nuclear armament, it warned that this will inevitably trigger a nuclear domino effect and spark arms races in the region. An expert says that because the fact sheet covers such a wide range of issues and includes many elements that significantly affect North Korea's security posture, it's highly likely that the regime needed some time to prepare an appropriate response.
North Korea has long been unhappy about its denuclearization being singled out. In particular, Pyongyang expressed its dissatisfaction by implying that focusing on North Korea's denuclearization rather than the denuclearization of the entire Korean Peninsula is unfair and a double standard.
To this, South Korea's presidential office said that the South Korean government does not have hostile intentions toward the North, and that it will continue to make consistent efforts to ease tensions and restore trust between the two Koreas. The top office underlines that the security cooperation between Seoul and Washington is to strengthen security and safeguard national interests. Meanwhile, South Korea's Unification Ministry said Pyongyang's response is rather calibrated, as it does not mention the names of the country's leaders. An Song-jin, Arirang News.
Now, achieving a nuclear-free Korean Peninsula remains an absolute objective that must never be abandoned. That is, according to South Korea's Foreign Minister Jo Hyun in a written keynote address to the Seoul Diplomacy Forum 2025. Jo's speech on Tuesday underscored that Korea's top security priority is preventing war and ensuring the Korean Peninsula does not become a flashpoint for armed conflict. He said the government will pursue a phased approach that prevents North Korea's nuclear capabilities from further developing and ultimately dismantles its weapons program. The minister also highlighted the need to restore dialogue, whether through North Korea-U.S. or inter-Korean channels. He, however, added Seoul will aim to enhance its own defense capabilities based on its alliance with the U.S. In other news, the world's largest virtual asset exchange may be playing a crucial part in facilitating North Korea's money laundering. Our Pyongyang explains.
According to the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists, or ICIJ, about $900 million worth of stolen Ethereum flowed into 5 Binance accounts as part of a large-scale laundering operation. The funds are believed to come from the roughly $1.5 billion Ethereum theft carried out earlier this year at a Dubai-based exchange, making it one of the biggest crypto hacks ever recorded. Investigators say North Korea's Lazarus Group used a crypto swapping service known as Thorchain to convert the Ethereum into Bitcoin before transferring it into Binance accounts. Blockchain data from those accounts shows transaction volume surging over a 10-day period that experts believe aligns with the laundering timeline. The ICIJ examined transaction records from Binance and other exchanges with more than 20 blockchain specialists and analytic firms. Their findings indicate that Binance failed to block illicit funds tied not only to North Korea, but also to major criminal organizations around the world. The Huiwan Group, linked to large-scale scam operations in Cambodia, was also found to have deposited at least $400 million into Binance between 2024 and 2025. Others include Mexican drug cartels, Chinese fentanyl traffickers, and Russian money laundering groups. In a response, Binance said it cannot prevent deposits from being placed on the platform, but emphasized that it cooperates closely with global law enforcement agencies and takes action when suspicious activity is identified. Pyongyang, Arirang News.
Come December, Seoul and Washington will sit down for talks on non-tariff arenas of trade, having laid down and writing their tariff negotiations last week. Our correspondent Moon Ji-young has more.
With the focus in South Korea-U.S. trade relations now shifting to non-tariff issues that require further negotiations, Korea is gearing up for talks with the U.S. next month. Seoul's Trade Ministry announced Monday that officials plan to meet with the U.S. trade representative in December to discuss concrete implementation measures for recent trade agreements. This upcoming Joint Free Trade Agreement Committee meeting will cover various non-tariff trade barrier issues. Both sides committed to addressing non-tariff barriers affecting trade in food and agriculture products by establishing a U.S. desk dedicated to requests for U.S. horticultural products. While the Korean Agriculture Ministry called it a channel to strengthen communication, some experts point to its potential long-term implications.
While the U.S. desk could positively help resolve non-tariff barriers like inspection delays, its establishment also structurally strengthens the possibility of pressure for agricultural market opening.
The joint fact sheet also detailed significant changes in the automobile sector. South Korea agreed to eliminate the 50,000 unit cap on U.S.-made vehicles that meet safety standards, allowing them to enter the Korean market without extra modifications. The agreement includes provisions to ensure U.S. digital service companies avoid discrimination in areas such as network fees and online platform regulations. It also commits to easing cross-border data transfers for location, reinsurance, and personal information. These measures aim to align digital service rules with U.S. companies' demands, such as Google's for the export of high-definition map data. Talks are also expected to resume on the tariff-free status for generic drugs. Though the U.S. previously sought a 100% tariff, Korea secured a no-tariff deal, matching those with Japan and the EU. However, this exemption is conditional on the FTA committee agreeing on non-tariff plans, meaning potential delays if Korea doesn't present adequate easing measures. 문지영, Arirang News.
The global asset markets are hitting a wall as stocks, gold, and Bitcoin have all been showing weak performances over the past few weeks. Also, today on Tuesday, the Kospi saw an over 3% drop to close below 4,000. Our Park Junan has the details.
This year, global asset markets have seen what many are calling an everything rally, driven by sharp gains in U.S. tech stocks, South Korean semiconductor shares, Japanese equities, Bitcoin, gold, and even bonds. The value of all asset types had kept climbing together on expectations of AI-driven growth and steady rate cuts by the U.S. Federal Reserve. However, over the past few weeks, that momentum has been cooling down. Throughout Monday and Tuesday, nearly every major risk asset fell at the same time on global markets. The Kospi plunged by over 3% on Tuesday to close below the 4,000 mark. Japan's Nikkei 225 lost more than 2%, and the United States Nasdaq also dipped, alongside Bitcoin falling under $90,000 for the first time in 7 months. Even gold, which is considered the traditional safe haven, saw something of a decline. The main driver of the market's sell-off was a dip in U.S. tech stocks. Some mega hedge funds are betting against these tech stocks, and some investors are questioning whether the astronomical capital spending on AI infrastructure will ever bring matching profits. In South Korea, the country's two chip giants, Samsung Electronics and SK Hynix, which account for over 30% of the Kospi index, saw sharp declines. Foreigners and institutions have aggressively sold, while retail investors stepped in to buy. While just a month ago, the chances of the U.S. Central Bank lowering its key interest rate in December were over 93%. However, as of Tuesday per CME Group's FedWatch, the chances are now 48.4%, which means the bank might actually maintain its key interest rate at 3.75% to 4%. The Fed is taking a cautious stance on lowering the rate, citing inflationary pressures. If borrowing costs stay high because the Fed doesn't cut rates, investors may worry about corporate performance, which could eventually lead them to sell stocks. With a sentiment of uncertainty building across global markets, whether the everything rally can regain momentum remains a question for global investors. Park Junan, Arirang News.
The pace of household debt slowed in the third quarter of this year amid the presence of tougher lending regulations. But the total debt pile continues to inch closer to the 2 quadrillion won mark. Kim Do-yeon reports.
The Bank of Korea announced on Tuesday that the total balance of household credit stood at 1,968 trillion won, roughly $1.36 trillion at the end of September. This is an increase of 14.9 trillion won from the previous quarter. While still an increase, it marks a significant slowdown from the second quarter, which saw revised growth of 25.1 trillion won. The slowdown was led by household loans, which grew by 12 trillion won. Mortgage loans increased by 11.6 trillion won, a smaller rise than the previous quarter's 14.4 trillion. The central bank attributed this to the government's debt management measures implemented on June 27th, implemented to tackle rising home prices and a limited number of mortgages being taken out.
The slowdown in the growth of other loans is attributable to credit loans switching to a decrease. And as for whether this is the effect of the policy, well, because credit loans themselves were restricted to within a borrower's annual income, you can see this as being mostly the effect of the policy.
The central bank stressed that its primary goal is not to drastically shrink the debt, but to stabilize it relative to the size of the economy.
First, I would like to state that the government and the Bank of Korea are aiming to gradually stabilize the household debt to nominal GDP ratio downwards, rather than drastically reducing the scale of household debt itself.
On that front, the BOK noted that with real GDP growing 1.7% in the third quarter, the household debt to GDP ratio is likely to fall. The bank expects this stabilizing trend for mortgage loans to continue as the effects of both the June and the additional October regulations are felt in the market. Meanwhile, sales credit, which is mostly credit card debt, rose by 3 trillion won. The BOK attributed this to increased car usage during the summer vacation season, local tax payments, and a general rebound in private consumption. However, the slowdown in total loans masks a surge in debt-fueled stock investment. While bank and other institutional loans fell, loans from securities firms and other intermediaries increased by 3.7 trillion won, about $2.5 billion, amid a bullish stock market. The central bank noted this trend may be continuing as separate October data showed. Other loans rising by 1.04 trillion won, about $955 million, partly due to stock investment demand. Kim Do-yeon, Arirang News.
The South Korean government announced on Tuesday that it had won a legal battle in an investor-state dispute settlement case involving the foreign private equity fund Lone Star. This comes around 2 years after the government filed a request to the International Center for Settlement of Investment Disputes in August 2023 to overturn the original ISDS ruling. Lone Star bought the Korea Exchange Bank in 2003 and later sold it for a large profit, then filed an ISDS claim in 2012, alleging the Korean government interfered in the sale and caused over $4.6 billion in losses and damages. The government formed a task force to respond, and the latest ruling overturns the $216.5 million award, which included interest, and requires a Lone Star to reimburse South Korea's legal costs. South Korea's record-breaking fiscal budget for 2026 is now in its most critical phase of review at the National Assembly, with lawmakers racing toward the December 2nd deadline and clashing over spending priorities. For more, we are joined by our political correspondent Moon Hae-ryun here in the studio. Welcome, Hae-ryun.
Good evening, Tommy.
So, Hae-ryun, the last time we talked about the budget review, which was 2 weeks ago, we had just entered the first phase of the review process with President Lee Jae-myung delivering his policy speech at the National Assembly. At this point, what stage are we at with the budget review?
So, Tommy, as you've said, it's been 2 weeks since President Lee gave his speech at the National Assembly, and we're now entering the final stage of deliberations for next year's fiscal budget. The National Assembly Special Committee on Budget and Accounts held a public hearing on the proposal, where experts and committee members debated the core contents of the budget bill, and then followed up with general policy inquiries on various ministries. And starting Monday, the Budget Adjustment Subcommittee began the detailed review process, where it's now combing through spending items to make adjustments to allocations and resolving disputes between the ruling and opposition parties.
Well, Hae-ryung, we know time is ticking, but have there been any changes made to the government's, budget bill proposal so far?
So over the past 2 weeks, there's been a few changes made to the government's proposed budget bill, and one of them is cuts to the prosecution's special activity budget, where the National Assembly's Legislation and Judiciary Committee has moved to approve 3.15 billion Korean won less than what the government originally requested. So lawmakers from the ruling bloc argued that the prosecution's investigative powers have been sharply reduced, and with the prosecutor's office set to be abolished next October, cuts were necessary. The committee also attached new conditions, including a rule blocking special activity funds from being used at any prosecutor's office where the chief prosecutor is found to have breached political neutrality by participating in collective action. Meanwhile, the defense budget allocated for next year has been increased by nearly 300 billion won. A significant portion of the increase goes towards personnel costs, with lawmakers adding funds to raise on-duty allowances for soldiers to match those of civilian government workers and boosting allowances for troops relocating due to personnel transfers. Additional increases have also been made for barrack support facilities and training programs to develop artificial intelligence talent within the armed forces.
Now, Hae-ryung, we have to talk about the main points of contention between the ruling party and the opposition party. What are they?
So the government's proposed budget for 2026 is actually South Korea's largest annual budget to date, coming in at 728 trillion Korean won, or just under $500 billion US. And as a result, the expansionary fiscal policy of the Lee administration has been a key area of conflict between the ruling Democratic Party and the main opposition People Power Party, accusing each other of engaging in populism.
2024 tax shortfall, 30.8 trillion won. Yet the Yoon administration issued no bonds and covered it by reallocating funds.
You say you'll invest 10.1 trillion to make Korea a top 3 AI power. But didn't you allocate 13 trillion in the second supplementary budget for livelihood recovery payments?
Lawmakers also zeroed in on one of the Lee administration's key policy pledges called a rural basic income that provides regular monetary handouts to all residents living in rural areas, regardless of their job, income, or age. Starting in 2026, it will be launched as a 2-year pilot program in selected rural areas, and each resident will receive a set amount in the form of local community vouchers every month that essentially functions as cash. The DP has been supporting this policy by saying that it will revitalize local regions, while the PPP has warned that it could become a massive black hole in the budget.
Rural areas are beautiful but inaccessible. Build roads, guarantee basic income, and people will come.
This program will cost around 360 billion, including local contributions, while essential farmer budgets such as direct payment programs have been cut by hundreds of billions.
As the Budget Subcommittee continues to make adjustments before the December 2nd deadline, the parties are expected to continue clashing over the scope and sustainability of the administration's spending next year.
So 2 more weeks of clashes at least, and 2 more weeks to actually narrow their differences. Hae-ryung, thanks for coming in tonight.
Thank you for having me.
The coldest morning so far this fall appeared across the country today. The first snow was also seen in Chungcheongnam-do province today as the rain turned into snow in the cold weather. Temperatures in most areas stayed in the single digits. With freezing winds blowing, it felt even colder than the actual readings. These freezing conditions will continue tomorrow morning, with Seoul plummeting to -2 degrees Celsius, similar to today. From Thursday afternoon, temperatures will recover back to the average for this time of year. Tomorrow morning, Chuncheon will start off at -5 degrees, Gwangju and Busan at 3 degrees. Daily highs will rise up to 8 degrees in Seoul and Chuncheon, 9 degrees in Daejeon. As a dry weather advisory is in place along the East Coast, please be careful not to cause any wildfires. That's all for Korea. Here are the weather conditions around the world.
That is all we have for tonight. I'm Kim Dami. From all of us here at Arirang, thanks for watching and good night.